We were expecting a ban list for premium. What we didn't expect is a rule change for standard.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today it's a very special episode because we're not talking about new card reveals, we're talking about a new rule or a rule change within Vanguard. Now, we were expecting a rule update in terms of a new ban list update for premium, but apparently that's gonna be revealed next Tuesday, which immediately will go into effect on October the 1st, the same week. But more on that at the end of this video. What I mainly want to talk about is a brand new rule update for standard. Because yes, things are about to change in standard, because the new rule that they introduced in standard is that you can no longer use more than 8 copies of one type of trigger, excluding the heal triggers, because they still have the same restriction that you can only have 4 in decks. Which means you can only run up to 8 crits, or up to 8 draws, or up to 8 fronts in one particular deck at a time. This has definitely some implications for standard, and that's the important thing here. This rule change only applies to standard overdress. So not for V Premium and not for Premium. You can still run your 12 crit and 16 crit builds in those formats. And that's the major implication of this rule change, where we can't have these multi-crit builds being a thing in overdress. The crazy thing about this rule change is that it will not impact the English format at all. Like, there won't change anything for us, because so far we only have up to 8 crits or up to 8 of a single type trigger in any of the 5 nations. We haven't got Lyrical Monastery yet, which got 4 of every type, and set 3 isn't here. So what changed for Japan is that only the Lyrical Monastery decks are gonna lose some of their triggers, because some builds did run more than 8 of a particular trigger type. But besides that, it also don't change for them, because the 5 great nations still only had access to 8 of the same type. What this actually means for decks themselves and how the game is gonna evolve from this point onward is that decks won't be as aggressive as they used to be in V Premium or Premium, where you could run these high crit number decks, because now the chance of actually critting somebody in the early game or maybe mid game where it's vulnerable is gonna be less consistent. It's not going to be as often where you're suddenly gonna ram your opponent to 4 or 5 damage in the early game, or potentially just double crit them out of nowhere. It can still happen with 8, but it won't be as often as you could imagine with 12 crits. And this also promotes the use of front triggers or draws, making players also forced to do a different decision in trying to figure out what is the better trigger lineup, because it's a lot easier to just go for 12 crits in a lot of instances, because it just puts a lot of pressure, it puts a lot of aggression. The easy go answer is, if I can kill my opponent fast enough, I don't have to worry about potential resource issues that can come later in the game, or that I'm reliant on a certain piece, because if they're already dead, I don't need that piece, or I don't need those resources. Now, with lowering the amount of crits that you can run in your deck, you're forcing players to make more decisions about also thinking about the late game, because you're not going to crit your opponent as consistent as possible to just close the game as early as possible. Now, personally myself, I like this rule change because it slows the game down a bit, where you're not going to die randomly as often to a random crit or maybe a double crit, and it promotes the game to be a bit slower, which means games will be more tactical. And by keeping it at maximum 8 instead of potentially 4, makes this crit situation less feel bad, because you are assuming it's going to happen. With 8 crits in your deck, it's still a likely chance to actually happen, so you are going to prepare for it. But if this number was 4, it's significantly less likable that it's gonna happen, so you're not really gonna keep it in your mind that it might happen. Thus, when it happens, you're gonna be very salty about it, because the chance of it actually happens is relatively low. And that doesn't really is going to be a case with 8, because you should be aware that it's going to happen, but luckily it won't be as often if it was with 12. Now, that said, I am curious what this will mean for future support, because we already saw them introducing front triggers with skills. We now get the new crits with skills. So now that they forced us to maximum playing 8 of a single type, will it mean that they might slow down with triggers with skills, or that they are now going to double down on them? Because the thing is, now you're actively going to power creep triggers. Because first we already had 2 copies of a front, then we got the new fronts which are going to be 20k shield, and because we cannot run 12 fronts anymore, if we're gonna run fronts, that's gonna replace the vanilla front. So we already saw this because most decks only played 3 to 4 fronts, which immediately got replaced with these new higher shield fronts. But that's also going to happen with these crits in set 3 because they have an extra skill, so why wouldn't you just play them for them? And when they first got revealed, a lot of players just assumed, well, we're just gonna run 11 or 12 crits in lots of decks so it doesn't replace a crit. But now with only maximum 8 crits, you know for a fact that those skill crits are going to replace one of the vanilla crits. So I'm curious if that will change anything in future development of triggers, because we're going to outright power creep those triggers itself. Now personally, I don't really mind about them because I much rather have triggers with skills, thus making your deck more as an entire engine, whereas triggers don't feel like just clunky cards being forced to run. Now they can actually be an integral part to your engine, and you're going to choose which type of trigger with which skill is going to matter for your deck or not. So personally, I hope we're going to go to that route, because that's the same with G. Triggers actually were a part of your deck building aspect because they had skills that definitely work with your engine. So overall, I'm very happy with this rule change because I much rather have less crits being dominant in a format, so it can be a bit slower and we're forced to make different decisions as well, because we have plenty of trigger choices, because we still have draws, we still have fronts, maybe we get another trigger type in the future as well, but it's not like we're forced to run always the same trigger type, but we're not forced to run the same trigger lineup because we still have multiple choices left for the remainder 3 to 4 triggers, because it's not maximum 4. If they did a maximum 4, it's a different story, because it meant every deck had to play the same trigger lineup, because except for one card, because then you can choose which trigger is going to run 3 copies instead of 4, because the over trigger is a thing. Now for the other thing, I already teased at the beginning about the new premium ban list, which is going to be released next week. The interesting thing about that particular ban list is that we're probably gonna see a lot of things on there, and maybe also things that might be surprising to some, because Dr. O explained that Japanese players might be surprised with certain hits because they might not be as prevalent in their format, but they have been looking at the English side of things. They have been searching around to not only topping cards, but may also just resources online where people are talking about busted combos, cards that are problematic, and they've been researching that if those cards are actually problematic and if they should get hit. And apparently they found them, and we're going to see them on the ban list next week, which means anything is possible to be hit. So I think a lot of players are immediately going to assume the big 5 or big 6 for premium that's going to need to be neutered. But maybe they go even further beyond that and actually hit some random problematic cards or certain interactions. A good example of a card that's going to be hit is the new double offer Darkseid in set 3, which has this infinite loop that you can create with Dentarian. It's pretty obvious that something is that's going to give at some point. But I think we're going to see more cards like that that's going to hit because they have some type of interaction which is not what they desired for, and hopefully this is going to make premium very exciting. Now that said, because this is the case, I'm not gonna do a premium ban list prediction, because for one, I'm not knowledgeable enough in the format to know every problematic interaction and situation, because I'm definitely gonna overlook something, and two, we probably already know which cards should get hit as it's the main problematic decks, and besides that there's nothing really any special, so I don't really see the need of that particular video. But that's actually about everything that we got today, so not a lot of happened except for the rule change in standard and the announcement of the premium ban list next week. Overall, I'm very happy with these changes and with the fastness of this, because for anybody that isn't aware, this trigger rule that they changed, I feel that this is directly a response to what happened within the Japanese community, where there was this outrage about issues that they had with overdress, and one of the points they brought to light was the introduction of the new triggers, the new crit, where things are going to get out of control, where we already going to have 12 crits in set 3 very early on in the game's life cycle, especially with overdress having a limited amount of shield value. And I forgot to address that in this video. Another reason why going to a maximum of 8 crits is very good is because overdress of all the formats has less shield value accessible, especially with Persona Ride also giving a lot of power to the board. Having this increased number of crits can be very problematic because it's also harder to guard against every single attack. So I'm very pleased with the fact that Bushiroad once again reacted very fast, gave us a legitimate answer and a solution to this problem. I'm very curious of what they're going to do moving forward. Now, Do I think they will potentially revert this rule somewhere down the line? Yes. I think there might be a situation maybe in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, once shield power creep, the defense creep started to catch up on the whole situation, they might say, you know what? We can give the players the room to actually experiment with more of the same type of trigger, which basically most players are immediately going to go to crit. We hardly see decks running more than 8 fronts or draws, except if there's actually some synergy. Looking at you, God and Dragon. But I think it might be possible that they might revert this rule somewhere down the line. But definitely not within the near future. That's for sure certain. But if it does happen, we can use this clip as once again proof that I called things from the future. But that said, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of these new rule changes, as well as what are your thoughts for the upcoming premium ban list, if you play premium at all, because I'm very curious on what your thoughts are about on the whole subject. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely Patreons over at patreon.com/FingerinSider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FingerinSider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!